When the autumn came to our coast, just a little ahead of the quail shooting season, when all the summer visitors went away from Wrightsville Beach, and the gray shingled little beach houses had their windows tacked shut against the northern gales, when the skies got as gray as the shingles and a wood fire was nice at night and all the little shops closed for the long, unprofitable off season. That was when the old man and I got into big business with each other. Makes a wonderful balance of nature, the old man would say, eyeing the woodpile speculatively, which made me know all of a sudden that he was going to suggest an axe and a small boy to wield it. When the Dodlam tourists leave, the bluefish cannot be very far behind. There is a book along those lines I recall called If Winter Comes or some such, except I think the writer was reading more spring than bluefish into the script. As I remember the old man, he never said anything at all that you couldn't walk away from 3 ways and still find a fresh idea in it. I got to where I could listen to him with only one ear, separating the meat from the philosophy, and it wasn't until a lot of years later, when I grew up to be a man, that I found I remembered more philosophy than meat. It was now Labor Day, the old man said. Never quite understood why they call it that, since nobody works on the weekend before the Monday they name it after. But on Tuesday, the boys will all be gone and the men will be left, and the bluefish, having watched carefully from topsail, will come in to commune with the men. Bluefish do not like summer tourists. They like people who admire nor'easters and don't mind a little rain and a squall or two. The first thing we will do about bluefish, the old man continued, is to catch a mess of them easy so you can learn to appreciate the other way. It's too early for them to be inshore in the sloughs, so we will go trolling for bluefish like the rich people do and let the boat kill them. I got a connection in the Coast Guard. We will go to Southport and leave early in the morning with Captain Willis. We went on the cutter and we went out past Caswell, out from Southport and from around Frying Pan Shoals. The driver of the boat, he had to be named Midyet because nearly all Coast Guarders came from Orcacoke Island near Hatteras, and they're all named Midyet down there. Tooled the little craft so close to the edge of the shoals you could touch sand with your left hand and see 10 fathoms of water to your right. The water was as clear and cold blue as in Bermuda, and the sand as white. The bell buoy was just a little bit behind you, making mournful sounds, and the lightship was over there as lonesome as men who lived on her. The gulls wheeled and scammed, and the gnats prowled the water looking for small bait, and off the sand shoals you could see the big red living shoals of menhaden, pogies, we called them, that the fishing fleet preyed on to make fish scrap fertilizer. Here was where the mackerel, we always called them Spanish mackerel, lived, and the kingfish or horse mackerel lived. And here was where the bluefish and the sea trout came into the shallows for the small mullet and the shrimp that swarmed off the rim of the shoals. This is silly fishing, the old man says. Don't take any sense or skill at all. All you need is a rod and some line and a hook and piece of bone to make the hook look like a minnow. Heave her over and the bluefish fight each other for the right to take it. The speed of the boat half kills the fish, so it is just a matter of hauling them in. Try it and see for yourself. He handed me a light bass rod, and I flipped the bone minnow over the stern. The line hadn't paid out 20 yards when there was a strike, and the rod bent double. It was pretty tough reeling, what with the boat going one way and the fish trying to go another, but I hauled him in. It was a nice bluefish, about 2 pounds, steely blue in the sun, with his jaw mean-looking and pugnacious, and his sharp teeth. He was the first of 100, some smaller, which we threw back, and some bigger. One was a 4-pounder. Later on, we hooked into a school of mackerel, big, streamlined, speckly fellows that have a chin like a barracuda, and it was the same story. When we finished about 10 a.m., we had a boat full of fish, blues, mackerels, a few bonito, and a couple of big kingfish. We had enough fish to feed the whole Coast Guard station and half of the town. Like the old man said, it wasn't much sport after the first dozen, but there wasn't anything wrong with them in the skillet or on the little makeshift barbecue the old man rigged in front of the shack. I feel real sorry for people who never had a chance at broiled bluefish or mackerel when the fish is so fresh you have to kill him before you clean him. Some say that blues and mackerels are too fat and oily, but there are some people who don't like snails or oysters and think carrots are just dandy. The way the old man cooked them, they tasted better than any fish has a right to taste. He just laid them on the grill over the hot coals and left them until you could see the skin blistering and cracking and turning golden black, with the white showing through the grease sizzling steadily onto the coals. When he finally took them off, he had to do it with a flapjack turner. They were so tender they just fell apart. He bathed them in about a half a pound of butter per fish, poured vinegar over them, then dusted them with black pepper. I ate about 4 pounds of fish before I quit. Later on in the fall, after the first steady northerns had begun to cut sloughs through the beaches and it was getting chilly in the afternoons, he announced one day after lunch that it was time to really go fishing. "We'll go to Corn Cake," he said. "I've got a hunch the puppy drum are hungry and are in those sloughs stuffing themselves on sand fleas. This is my kind of fishing. It ain't murder, it's fishing." He dug out 2 big surf rods from under the house and got a big tackle box from his bedroom. We went down to the waterfront and bought some salt mullet, big ones, thickly crusted with salt, and set out. We took our time. The old man said it was no use fishing or hunting any time except real early in the morning or late in the afternoon, because even a fish or a jackrabbit had too much sense to bustle around in the heat of the day. It was a gray, mean day with the spoon flying and the gulls moaning low and complaining. Along about 5 p.m. it was chilly enough for a sweater and the water was cold on my bare legs. The old man spent the first hour trying to teach me to cast with no bait on my hook. It looked so easy the way he did it. It looked impossible the way I did it. He would take the rod, wade out over his knobby old knees, bring the rod back over his shoulder with about 4 feet of line running free. Then he would bring the rod up and over in one single smooth motion with a whip on the end of the cast. The line would sing through the reel, and heavy pyramid-shaped sinker would go whistling out to sea for maybe 40 or 50 yards and fall with a plunk right where he was aiming in the slough. Then he'd reel in very slowly, just enough to keep the line always taut. When I did it, I either threw the sinker into the water at my feet or jammed the reel and threw the sinker away entirely, or had a backlash right in the middle of the cast. We spent most of the early afternoon unsnarling the reel or putting iodine on the fingers I cut and knocked the line burned. But I expect young fellows learn pretty fast to do things with their hands, and by dusk I was still clumsy but getting the line out far enough to where at least some fish were. Then the old man took his saw-backed ripping knife and showed me how to cut the salt mullets in strips, slicing them 1.5-inch strips diagonally across the fish. Next he showed me how to work the hook through the strips, weaving it back and forth until the mullet was firm and only the tip of the barb showed. The reason he said that we used the mullet instead of fresh bait or shrimps was that the salt had toughened the skin and she'd stay on the hook in rough surf, whereas the other stuff would work off every cast. The old man had used a long leader made out of wire, and he hooked 2 leaders, 2 hooks, and 2 baits into each line. He grinned to himself, humming quietly as he fixed the tackle. His square hands with the broken stubby fingers and with the old man's brown liver spots on the back looked clumsy, but they weren't. Anything he handled, from a knife to a gun to a fiddle, was handled so swift and well that it looked easy. It was growing dark when I stepped out into the icy gray water and cast. The line went out pretty well, the baits whirling through the air, and settled into the slough with a satisfactory chunk. I began to wind her up to get the belly out of the line when 2 bolts of lightning struck. The line screamed out of the reel, and I burned some more fingers before I could get the drag on. It was like being tied fast to 2 horses, each with his own idea about where he was headed. It seemed that whatever was on that line was going to pull me right into the ocean. But then I began to walk slowly backwards, cranking a little bit, keeping the tension on the rod by holding the tip high. The reel closed to my belly and the rod jammed under my arm. I finally backed up to where the dunes started and the sea oats grew, and I could see the fish coming out of the water, flopping and fighting, even on the silver stands. They looked big, like live logs on the beach. I started toward them now, reeling in the slack, and went down to where they lay on the sand. They were both big bluefish, 3 or 4 pounds each. I felt like I had just played 4 quarters of football. I played out pretty quick because the rod and reel were heavy, and every time I cast, when I didn't backlash, 2 big bluefish tied into me as soon as the sinker settled. It was taking me 15 to 20 minutes to land the ones I landed. The ones I lost didn't take so long, and I lost a good deal more than I beached. By black dark, I was cold and wet and sore all over. My hands were cut and full of burning salt, and my back ached like a dissatisfied tooth. But I had caught maybe a dozen big blues, and once a 10-pound puppy drum with a big black spot on his silver backside. After a while, I built a fire out of some driftwood and sat down to chew on some raw mullet, which tasted delicious, and to watch the old man work. The moon rose about full, and it was like something I had never seen or imagined. The old man would wade out and cast into the slough. He would back up, and suddenly he would strike his rod, which would bend double. He would then begin the slow and dignified backward march up the beach, fighting the fish. I was fascinated watching what eventually emerged from the dark seas onto the moonlit sands. He fished until midnight. Once he hooked into 2 drum, and not puppies. One weighed 22 pounds and the other 20. He was nearly an hour getting them ashore, and when he finally slid up on the sand, they looked as big as a couple of Coast Guard surfboats. He never took a line out of the sea without 2 fish on it. They were starving, I guess, because he never quit until he was exhausted, and they were still striking 2 at a time. The second the bait hit, the old man had been dead a long time now. But I'll never forget the way he looked in the moonlight, horsing 2 channel bass onto the beach with them birds screaming and the wind high. This, the old man said, as we headed home with the car full of fish, is what fishing can be like when you earn your fish and don't kill him with a boat. I'd rather have 2 mad bluefish on the same line in a cold ocean than catch all the sailfish and marlin ever made. The only thing I know of that's better is a frisky Atlantic salmon in a cold Canadian stream on about 6 ounces of fly rod. I hope you get a chance to try it someday when you're bigger. I did get a chance when I was bigger, and it was 28 pounds of salmon, and he worked me an hour and a half. But he never gave me what I got out of those first 2 bluefish in an angry autumn sea. Now the summer was completely gone, and all the memories of the summer. The time of year I liked better than any other had started. You could tell in so many ways that the summer was finished. Your legs didn't sweat the crease out of your Sunday pants anymore, and there was just a little nip in the evening air. The dogs that had been listless and shedding hair in the sticky heat got into condition again without being dosed, and began to look hopefully at the Tin Liz like maybe a ride was indicated. The milky smell of summer was all gone out of the air, and had been replaced by the smell of leaves burning and the tart odor of the last of the grapes. You could feel your blood sprinkling inside you, no longer heavy with the summer lethargy. A hot breakfast, pancakes and sausage and eggs, busted and it mixed into the grits, tasted just fine. The leaves were beginning to crinkle a little on the edges, and the first norther that brought the marsh hens flapping up from the flooded marshes had already come and gone. A few ducks, teal mostly, were beginning to drop in. I don't know if you remember clearly the unspoken promise of excitement that early autumn brings, just before the frost comes to grizzle the grass in the early morning, before the chinequapins are ripe in their burry shells, before the permissons lose the alm taste that twists your mouth. It's sort of like the 23rd of December. Christmas isn't quite here, but it's close enough to ruin your sleep. This was a time when we went fishing seriously on the weekends, fishing in the cold gray sea that always carried a chop except in the long, smooth sloughs, fishing in the inlets, and fishing off a long pier that went away out into the ocean. It was called Cure's Pier, if I remember right, and it cost something 10 cents or 2 bits to fish off it. I used to see a couple of hundred fishermen casting off the pier, and there was so much fishing courtesy around in those days that when a man hung into a real big channel bass, all the fishermen on his side would reel in and let him work his fish to the shore. But by and large, there weren't many big ones snagged off Kerr's Pier. The stuff ran too little, 2-pound blues and an occasional sea trout, the old puppy drum, and a whole lot of whitening, which we called Virginia mullet. The old man and I didn't crave company very much. We went further down the coast from Carolina Beach past Kerr's to an old Fort Fisher where the big guns used to be aimed against the Civil War blockade runners. Down there we had the peculiar kind of solitude the old man loved, and which I loved then without ever knowing why we loved it. Oh, but that was a scary, desolate beach, the offset currents cutting great sloughs where the big fish lay. The silvery, sandy beach came down from steep dunes as high as mountains with just a fringe of sea oats. There weren't any houses as far as you could see. The bush was warped and gnarled by the winds that never stopped. The myrtle and the cedars and the little hunchbacked oaks twisted and tortured and ever buffeted. The thin screech of the wind was always there, and the water was cold. The rafts of sea ducks looked gloomy, and the birds always screamed louder there than on any other beach I can remember. The general air of age was heightened by the fact that you were always stumbling over an old cannonball or a rusty saber, and ghosts flew thick at nightfall. We used to stop off at Kerr's Pier once in a while just to swap lives with fishing friends. We were an odd bunch, I'm forced to admit. The ones I liked best was Chris Rongodis, or some such name as that, a flat-necked grease who owned a cafe naturally in town. Chris lived to fish. The restaurant was strictly sidebar. Chris always had a joke for me, or a slab of opala pie, or pinopla pie, or strumberry storch cake he'd fetch from the restaurant in a thermos of the hottest coffee in the world. He would tell me what it was like back in Greece, and I learned 3 bars of the Greek national anthem. Chris just about died laughing at my Greek accent. There was also a doctor and a dentist and a World War hero with most of himself shot loose. There was a Portuguese and a Frenchman and a big blousy old woman who wore pants and hip boots and cussed worse than anybody I ever heard when she lost a fish. I reckon it was my first real taste of the international set, except none of these internationals could have bribed their way into a parlor. The Portuguese even wore big gold earrings and shaved every other 4th of July. If you snapped a rod or threw your last leader or ran plumb out of cut bait, somebody would come along and lend you a hand without appearing to be doing you a favor. What I'm trying to tell you, how nice it was in the fall, in late October and early November, when the big blues ran close ashore to feed off the minnows and the sand fleas. Looking back, I can't think of any real big fish we caught, or any lives we saved, or anything poetic or fancy. But this I do remember, an infection I caught, which, if the good Lord is willing, I never aim to get cured of. That is the feeling of wonderful contentment a man can have on a lonesome beach that is chilling itself up for winter, sort of practice swinging to get ready for the bitter cold that's coming. We had a little weathered gray shingle and clapboard cottage rented for the fall fishing. It stuck up on a high bluff just behind Carolina and Kerr's Beach. If you stepped too spry off the front piazza, you would tumble right down into the brown moss-covered rocks, which weren't so much rocks as case-hardened sand. There was a rough board step, made of a ladder actually, that you had to climb up from the beach about 50 yards straight up. It wasn't very grand, I must say. It had a toilet and a ramshackle stove, and a bedroom and a sitting room and a fireplace. The fireplace was what made it. The fireplace drew so hard that it dang near carried the logs straight up the chimbley. That was how I pronounced chimney until I was about grown, and I still think chimbley. This place was home, Castle Sanctuary. I mind it so clear coming off that beach in the black night. The surf would be booming, spooky and sullen, sometimes wild and angry, and spume tossing when the wind freshened. Your feet in the heavy black rubber boots sank down into the squishy sand, and you had to pull them out with a conscious effort as you walked up from the firm, moist sand at the water's edge and slogged through the deep, loose sand to the first steep rise of bluff. You would naturally be carrying a heavy surf rod and a heavy reel and a tackle box, and were generally dragging a string of fish that started out about the size of anchovies and wound up weighing more than a marlin before you got 'em home. There would be an ache all through your shoulders from casting that heavy line with the 4-ounce sinker and a big slab of cut mullet. There would be an ache in the back of your legs from wading in and then walking backwards to reel in the fish. There would be cramps in your cold salt water, wrinkled red fingers, and your nose would be pink and running. If anybody had snapped you on the ear would have fallen off. Your feet were just plain frozen inside those clammy rubber boots, and you were salty and sandy from stem to stern. Somehow you wrestled your gear and yourself up the steep steps in the dark, and the door would open when you moved the wooden latch. The first fellow in lit the lamps, old smoky kerosene lamps, and there wasn't any quarrel about who fixed the fire. Among the old man's assorted rules was one unbreakable. You never left the house unless the dishes was washed and dried and stacked, and the beds made, the floor swept, and this above all, a correct fire laid and ready for the long, yellow-shafted, red-headed kitchen match to touch it into a flaring life. The old man said you couldn't set too much store by a fire, that a fire was all that separated man from beast. If you came right down to it, I believe him. I'd rather live in the yard than in a house that didn't have an open fireplace. One of the chores I never minded was being the vice president in charge of the fire detail. I loved to strangle off in the mornings with the sun still warm and bright before the afternoon winds and clouds chilled the beach, just perusing around for firewood. We had wonderful firewood, sad and twisted old logs, dulled silver gray from salt, big scantlings and pieces of wrecked boats and stuff like that, all bone dry and wind seasoned. The salt or something caused it to burn slow and steady with a blue flame like alcohol burns, and the smell was salt and sand and sea grapes and fire all together. All you needed under it was a few tight crumpled greasy old newspapers that the bait had been wrapped in, and a light wood knot or two, and when you nudged her with the match, she went up like Chicago when the old lady's cow kicked over the lantern. With the fire roaring, you could cut out one of those lamps because the fire made that wonderful flickering light, which will ruin your eyes if you try to read by it, but which I believe was responsible for making a president of Honest Abe. You backed up to her and warmed the seat of your pants with your boots still on, then turned and baked a little cold out of your chapped, wrinkled hands. Only then did you sit down and haul off the old man's boots, which one of his feet seized between your legs and the other in your chest, and then he helped you prise your boots off the same way. It's funny the things you remember, isn't it? I remember a pair of ankle slippers made out of sheepskin with the curly wool inside. I would set 'em to toast by the fire as soon as I came through the door. When I popped my bare feet into 'em, they were scorching and felt like a hot bath, a cup of coffee, and a pony for Christmas. Then some hot water on my hands to wash off the salt and the greasy fish and the dirt. Now I started out to do the supper. The old man said that in deference to his advanced years he had to take a little drink of his nerve tonic, and the least a boy could do would be to lay the table and set up the supper. I liked that, too, the old man sitting sprawled in a rocker in front of the fire, his feet spread whopper-jawed out toward the flames, puffing on his pipe and taking a little snort and talking kind of lazy about all that had happened that day. Shucks, getting supper wasn't any trouble at all. You just started the coffee in the tin percolator and got the butter out of the food safe and sliced off a few rounds of bread and dug up the marmalade or the jelly. We had an iron grill that we slid into the fireplace as soon as she began to cool down into nice rosy embers, and it didn't take a minute to lay the halves of yesterday's bluefish or sea trout onto the grill. About the time the fish started to crumble and fall down through the grill, I'd stick a skillet full of scrambled eggs over the fire, and in about 2 shakes, dinner was served. Full as ticks, we'd sit and talk over the second cup of coffee, and then the old man would bank the fire and blow out the lamp. We'd reel off to bed, dead from fatigue and food and fire. These trips were only on weekends, of course, because there was that business about education, which meant I was bespoken 5 days a week. But from Friday afternoon until Monday morning early, when the old man dragged me out of the bed before light in order to check my fingernails and cowlick for respectability, I was a mighty happy boy. And it's funny, as I was saying earlier, but I can't remember the fish. All I remember very clear are Chris the Greek and the cussing lady in the hip boots and the Portuguese with the earring, how the old man's face looked with the fire bright against it, making it cherry red on one side and shadow black on the other, and how the wind sounded thrashing on the stout gray shingles that kept us safe inside from storm. I haven't lit a fire from that day to this without seeing and even smelling a little bit the presence of beard and bourbon and tobacco and salt air and fish and fire that went to making up the old man. I guess that's why some people call me a firebug.